And with that bodhicitta in our mind or heart, do the verse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. Let's see. So for those who are following, we're on page 27 near the bottom, and we're up to mindfulness. We've covered. So we're in the section, right? We covered the section on the 5 omnipresent mental factors, and now we're going through the 5 object ascertaining mental factors. Right? And remember, these are not omnipresent, right? They're sometimes there and sometimes not there. We'll say more about that, but we're up to the 3rd of these, which are a group, right, of mental factors. And it's quite interesting, right? I mean, I'll just pause here. We talk, I mean, in our, it's actually interesting, isn't it? In our culture, we talk a lot about mindfulness right now. Like, actually, we didn't used to. I remember that. Actually, I remember when I was first, when I was first working as a psychologist, I met with other Buddhist therapists, and we were talking about wow, are we allowed to tell patients that it would be good for them to practice mindfulness? And we were like nervous to mention mindfulness to patients, which is hilarious now, because now it'd be hard to find a therapist who doesn't mention mindfulness, probably. Maybe not, but it's quite common. But I can remember when it was like, how do you introduce it? Because, actually, I guess we were in Virginia, so we were worried that fundamentalists would run out of the office screaming or something. It was actually a worry, which kids still could be. But anyway, we did introduce mindfulness in therapy, and then of course now it's quite popular. But actually, but mindfulness is not often. Actually, it's interesting. I've heard mindfulness teachers use definitions of mindfulness that are not the same as what Buddhism says. So what we're going to go into is a Buddhist definition of mindfulness, which is different than the way some secular mindfulness teachers would define mindfulness. This is the formal Buddhist teaching. Another point is here, this Tibetan word Drenpa is translated as mindfulness. Some books translate it as recollection, and in the Tibetan word is said to kind of combine elements, you will see this, we'll explore it, of both what we would call in English mindfulness and also recollection or memory. So, but it's not just memory, so it combines elements of both. And so here it says, regarding the entity of mindfulness, the compendium of knowledge, right? So this is the Abhidharma of Vasubandhu. So, we can again see this is very, Vasubandhu is a very authoritative author on this kind of topic. So in the Abhidharma, it says, what is mindfulness? And then he says, it is a non-forgetfulness of the mind with respect to a familiar object. It has the function of non-distraction. I'm going to read Art Engel's translation, he translated Vasubandhu's actual text, along with a commentary by Srimati. So same passage, it's just his translation of the same passage. He says, the avoidance of inattentiveness toward a familiar object, a mental discourse. And then he says, familiar indicates that there can be no recollection of an object that is unfamiliar. A familiar object is one that was previously experienced. Is where there is a discourse with a particular object, the mind will not be distracted to a different object or a different aspect of the object. And so again, both translations get at this point that a function of mindfulness is to prevent distraction. And what is distraction? It's kind of obvious, right? But distraction is where your mind is on an object and then it jumps to another object. So the function of mindfulness is, first of all, it's in regards to a familiar object by definition, right? And it serves the function of keeping the mind on the object. I want to pause here to note a few things, right? Like, actually, maybe I'll go to the next page because he's explaining it, and then we'll talk in more in detail. So it says, just as has been said above, it is a knower that possesses three features. Right? So now, our author, who is Yeshi Gelson, is going to sort of tease out some elements of that definition, right? So the objective feature, these three are, the objective feature means it's a familiar object. The subjective aspect feature is a non-forgetfulness upon having observed that object. And its functional feature is non-distraction, right? It doesn't allow the mind to jump away. And then he further elaborates. He says, for the first, he says, since mindfulness is not produced with respect to that which has not been previously familiarized with, the objective feature is stated to be a familiar object, right? So he's explaining that first one. Even though the mind might have previously familiarized itself with the object, if it does not presently dawn as an object of the mind, mindfulness will not occur. Thus, the subjective aspect feature is specified as a non-forgetfulness of the mind. And then since the stability of the mind is enhanced in dependence upon special mindfulness, its functional feature is specified as that of non-distraction. So I just want to kind of pause here and reflect together, right? I said where to mention this. Yeah, so here, maybe I'll say here a few things. One is a familiar object, right? So actually what they're getting at here in part, which is I think quite interesting and not what sometimes thought about, is that the mindfulness being discussed here is mindfulness of familiar object means a mental object, right, that we've known before. So it's not, one point they're making here, the implication, or yeah, the point they're making, that Vasubandhu and Yeshi Gelson are making, is that the mindfulness they're discussing here, mindfulness, yeah, this term mindfulness or recollection, right, is of a familiar object, and which means it's an object of the mind, not of the senses. So from this perspective, what they're getting at is that when you're developing your mindfulness, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Like, so sometimes we'll say we're going to be mindful of the breathing, right? Actually, what do you mean by that? We actually pause, right? Sometimes it can mean mindful of the present moment sensations of the breath, right? According to this definition, actually, let's go back here. Well, actually, no, that can be mindfulness. Sorry, it's concentration that can't be. So that can be mindfulness because it's still a familiar object, right? The breath. Sorry, I'm getting off into the next topic, which is the next of these. But it must be an object you're already familiar with, right? So I guess what I was trying to get to actually is for mindfulness, it can't be something totally new, right? That's what they're getting at. So if you're in a new setting and you see some new object, you can't be practicing mindfulness of it yet. That's what they're actually getting at here. It's only once you familiarize with the object that you can practice mindfulness of it. And mindfulness, actually, and this is important, I'll just explain it. Actually, mindfulness is, the reason why it's emphasized to a large extent in Buddhism, of course, is that mindfulness is important for developing meditative concentration. And as it says here about stability, it mentions the word, since stability of the mind is enhanced and depends upon special mindfulness. So what it's getting at is, for to develop meditative concentration, we need many factors, but two are sometimes emphasized: stability and clarity. And mindfulness helps increase our stability. That's what's important here. So in other words, that by staying with the object, you develop a stability of mind that doesn't allow the mind to jump away. Now, and a few more quick points. Ordinarily, like for beginners, all different things can cause their mind to jump away, right? You could be, your mind can jump away to like worries, right? Which would be like kind of fear. Your mind can jump away to something you're angry about. Your mind can jump away to something you're desirous of, and so on. So mindfulness keeps the mind from doing that, right? From jumping away. What they say actually in the teachings on calm abiding is that as you progress a little bit in your practice of meditation, then the main obstacle is desire, right? So they talk about, sometimes they translate excitement or excitation is often the word. What they mean by that is that the main obstacle to meditation is that we desire things. So our mind jumps mostly to what we desire. And mindfulness serves the function, right, of keeping the mind on the object and creating stability on the object so that it jumps away less and eventually not at all to the objects, and various kinds of objects, but mostly objects of desire. I'll pause there and see. It looked like, John, did you have a question?
I actually now have two questions. The first one is, when you talked about object, it sounded like it meant a physical object, but actually the object could be your breath. So it's a matter of focusing on something that you are familiar with, and breathing is not an object, but breathing is a act that we are all familiar with. But you're nodding your head, so I assume that means yes to that.
Yeah, one way I would say it is, you could say it's an object of mind. Like in other words, in Buddhism, when they talk about object, they don't mean a physical, like, so, you know, it would mean like subject object. They're talking about like subject object, right? So like it would be some object of awareness. So right. In that sense, so not a physical object, but it could be a physical object, but it really means an object of awareness. So, for example, you know, you could meditate. You know, your object could be the nature of suffering. Like of the Four Noble Truths, your object of awareness could be the truth of suffering, and that could be your object of mindfulness, or your object of mindfulness could be the suffering of sentient beings when you're cultivating mindfulness of compassion. So it means an object of awareness. Yeah, good question.
And then the second one, you use the word that we regularly lose our concentration during, at least for me, during meditation particularly. And you use the word desire, and at least to me, when I initially hear the word desire, it conjures up people thinking about money or a wonderful meal or a great bottle of wine. And your desire could be to be sitting with His Holiness in conversation. And that would still be a major distraction. So it's desire for something. The desire could be a physical thing, it could be a spiritual thing, but it's just the word desire is the key, is that you lose track of your breathing or your focus of meditation because of a desire for something else.
Yeah, in this context, you're right. It could be any. So in other words, as we said before, there in we in a previous topic I mentioned, in Buddhism there could be, if in the most basic sense of desire, there can be positive desires, like the desire to liberate others from suffering. But in the context of mindfulness, any desire for something other than the object you're focusing on is distraction. So any desire, so in that sense, yeah, anything would be an enemy of mindfulness, and mindfulness is trying to keep your mind on whatever chosen object.
Right. Even though your distraction may actually be a very good thing, it's still a distraction to what you're focused on.
Yep, yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's why in some, like, there are some Zen stories like that where they say, like, they give example, even if you actually, that's one way of interpreting, right, that famous Zen passage. Even if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, right? It's not literally you should kill the Buddha. It means if you're trying to focus on your object of meditation, don't let your mind even go to, even don't let your mind even drift away to, if you're supposed to be, actually they say that in the, like in deity yoga practice, if you're supposed to be practicing Tara and suddenly your mind goes to Avalokiteshvara, that's distraction. Bring your mind back to Tara, whatever the object would be if your mind. because it's, that's distraction away from, if you're doing meditation. So mindfulness is staying with your object and not distracting to whether it be a negative or a positive distraction. Yeah. Lynn. Yeah.
What if what if you're concentrating on something, or you think you are, okay, an object, and you say, well, I don't remember that, right? And then someone points out to you that you do remember that because you were told before, and then you say, oh yeah, I do remember that. Obviously there's some memory in there, but it's not immediate. It's not coming to the fore. So can you concentrate even though you're not cognizant immediately about being familiar with an object? If you have to be reminded, in other words.
I get it. Yeah. And one point that one of the Geshe made in his commentary on mindfulness was that in terms of like the recollection aspect of mindfulness is what you're getting at.
Right.
He was saying, some people have excellent recollection and some people have quite
foggy.
We can have a difficult with recollection. And so if you think of mindfulness, though, it's once it becomes familiar. Like, so let's say let's say I give a very simple example. Like if I don't remember a certain incident from childhood, and then somebody who I knew then says, oh yeah, don't you remember this happened? And then I remember it. Up to the point when I remember it, I can't practice mindfulness of it. Once I remember it, then if I focus on it and sort of stay with that recollection, now it's familiar because I remember it, then I can practice mindfulness. So up until that moment when it's familiar or you've really recollected it, you can't practice mindfulness. But once you do, then it's a familiar object, so, and then you can stay. Yeah, so that would be fine.
Okay.
And then well, before I go on, maybe I'll elaborate too here. So a few things I want to say. One is, remember, these mental factors, right? These object ascertaining mental factors are not intrinsically positive or negative, right? So that means, right, that mindfulness can be a virtuous or a non-virtuous mental factor. And and so the exact, like, let's see this right, like, if you were like, so for example, if a person was recollecting the details of somebody's house they were once in, and really, and staying with that recollection of the house in order to rob it, they would be being mindful of the house, right, the details of the house and so on, but it will be a non-virtuous mental factor in that context because their motivation is to steal, right? So by itself, mindfulness can be positive or negative, is one point I wanted to make. Yeah, that's true. So mindfulness is not intrinsically a positive mental factor, although it's required. It is a required and becomes positive when it's focused on virtue. And also, if you want to develop meditation, you need mindfulness. But but yeah, like effect, like, anyway, you get my point. People can do bad things. People can be mindful while doing negative actions and harming others. That wouldn't be virtuous. That's one point. Another point is sometimes some of the commentaries were, especially modern commentaries, were emphasizing something. So I just want to elaborate for a second, right? If the definition is a non-forgetfulness of the mind with respect to a familiar object, which has the function of non-distraction. One point that was made is oftentimes when we talk, there's the Satipatthana, the sutra, right? The 4 Foundations of Mindfulness Sutra. And that sutra emphasizes, mindfulness of 4 objects, right? And actually, those 4 objects are connected to the 4 noble truths, right? If you've heard the commentary on that, right? So mindfulness of the body. And actually, I just want to, one is there are many kinds of mindfulness. Those 4 are not the only kinds of mindfulness, is one point. Now, about those 4, right? Those 4 are supposed to be focused on the 4 noble truths. So mindfulness of the body, which would include the breathing and other aspects of the bodily awareness, awareness of the body, where the body is the object of mindfulness, is actually intended, of the Four Noble Truths, that emphasizes the truth of suffering, right? Because the body arose through the power of karma and mental afflictions, and is in the nature of suffering, according to Buddhism. One point I would make is that's not always what's emphasized in a modern society when they talk about mindfulness, but that is the emphasis according to Vasubandhu and the Buddha, and so on. So, and then mindfulness of feelings, right, is another one. And feelings is the mental factor of feelings we've covered. And mindfulness of feelings is another kind of mindfulness, right, which is an awareness of the truth of the cause of suffering. It helps one to understand the truth of the cause of suffering. Then mindfulness of consciousness itself, right, which is similar to like we preliminary to Mahamudra meditation, is a kind of mindfulness of consciousness. Anyway, mindfulness of consciousness is said to help one understand the truth of cessation. And then mindfulness of phenomena, you could say, is a meditation that is said to help one understand the truth of the path. So those are four kinds of mindfulness practice, right, that are often taught. And those are taught in the Theravadan traditions, right? Like, and they're also taught in the Mahayana traditions. But then, if you say if you say the function of mindfulness is non-forgetfulness of a familiar object, which has the function of non-distraction, right? I just want to point out, right, if you meditate on bodhicitta, right, then you're practicing mindfulness of, right, compassion, mindfulness of bodhicitta itself. If you meditate on, if you meditate on a deity, right, like Tara, then your mindfulness, the familiar object is Tara, right? And your mindfulness is of Tara. There's in the Lamrim, middle-length Lamrim, we studied that, right? There's a visualization where you meditate on the Buddha in front of you. Then your object of first you have to become familiar with the object, right? The Buddha. And then your familiar object that you're practicing mindfulness of is the Buddha, right? And so I just hope you can see like that if you contemplate this, then there are limitless kinds of mindfulness, actually, right? Literally, it's limitless, the objects that you could choose to practice mindfulness of. So that was a just a general point, right? Is so it could be any and if you're practicing the in highest yoga tantra completion stage, you practice mindfulness with regards to seed syllables in your subtle body or something, right? That's the object of mindfulness. So they're all different. I mean, there are limitless different objects of mindfulness, everything from feelings to subtle seed syllables to countless different deities to hand implements of deities to the Buddha, to the kindness of others, right? To your moral, like mindfulness of a moral code, mindfulness of like where you're not going to forget, right? Mindfulness means non-distraction. So if you're trying to practice morality, you have to be mindful of your moral commitments. Sujata has a commentary.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Lauren. I think it just left. How funny! I was not mindful of my question. I think it just left me. Yeah, it'll come back. Sorry about that.
Okay, just raise your hand again. That was funny. Mindfulness of the question about mindfulness. That's really fun. Then it says, okay, so and elaborating on what I just said, Kachin Yeshe Gelsen here says, this mode in which mindfulness possesses the three features is very important in both contexts of sutra and tantra, right? And that's in line with what we were just saying, right? Whether you're going to be mindful of a deity or mindful of bodhicitta or mindful of your ethical training, or you need those three things if you're going to do it, and you need to practice mindfulness or you won't progress. So then he quotes Nagarjuna's letter to a friend. O Lord, the Sugata, right, meaning the Buddha, taught that mindfulness of the body is the sole path to be traversed. Pay attention and guard it. Due to mindfulness degenerating, all qualities will be destroyed. So one point I want to make here is kind of interesting. Quote, right, mindfulness of what it says, mindfulness of the body is the sole path to be traversed. One point is like, at a certain phase of one's practice, one practices mindfulness of the body, right, to become aware of the truth of suffering. But was it say this right? But actually, one point is that it's not literally the soul path, right? Because Nagarjuna, for example, points out himself that there are times where the main path becomes mindfulness of emptiness, right? So at that time, your mind, your mindfulness would not be of physical body, but of emptiness. So when it says is the soul path, it means at a particular phase of practice. That at a certain point, you have to be mindful of your body. It doesn't mean it's the only object of mindfulness. Just to clarify that point. But what it is saying, which I think is really important, is due to mindfulness degenerating, all qualities will be destroyed, right? And another way of interpreting this passage is that you have to be mindful, in the sense of mindful of your body, is that you have to be mindful of your ethics, right? And that if you're not mindful of your ethical training, then literally all your good qualities will be destroyed, because you'll do unethical things, which will just, which will send you to the lower realms and cause all kinds of suffering for yourself and others. So in that sense, you could say mindfulness of the body in the sense of ethical training is absolutely required, is another point. But either way, the point here is that there are many different objects of mindfulness. It could be sometimes emptiness, which is a non-affirming negation. Sometimes it could be your body, which is an awareness of the truth of suffering. Sometimes it could be a deity, and so on. Now, Sujati, have your hand out, so you remember your question.
I remembered. Okay, so the first thing is in the Satipatthana Sutra, does it say that those four are the only four? And from past study that I've done, I feel like the person I learned from said these are the only four you're supposed to be. Like everything else isn't really an object of, isn't really supposed to be an object of mindfulness. So I'm curious if you know whether or not the sutra, or people interpret the sutra from the Theravadan perspective to be saying that these are the only four legitimate objects of mindfulness. That's my first question. I should have two.
I would say, first of all, I have the sutra here, but I don't recollect off the top of my head if it literally says that. But one point I would make is if it does, it would be similar to this passage where even Nagarjuna says the Sugata taught mindfulness of the body is the soul path, right? So sometimes like there are like in text it'll say things like that, but actually if you think of the Theravadan tradition, for example, you couldn't take that literally, because, for example, the 12 links of dependent origination are taught in the in the Theravadan tradition, and and the 12 links of dependent origination are a different topic of mindfulness than than the four foundations of mindfulness, and also like in the Theravadan tradition, for example, they would say you must be mindful of karma, right? And I guess you could categorize in one sense. Actually, that's interesting. I would debate with one point of debate though is under mindfulness of dharmas. I guess you could technically include dharma. Mindfulness of phenomena could include all phenomena. So in that sense, maybe you could say, actually, that's interesting. Then you could say the four foundational mindfulness include everything, because even everything is a phenomenon, right? And if you say even emptiness is an existent thing, it's a non-affirming negation. So it's not a functioning thing, but it is an existent thing. In the sense that it's not a it's an unconditioned phenomena, but it's still a phenomena. So I guess it depends how you define it. If you say under the fourth, if you say mindfulness of phenomena, then even like, let's say in the you could say the mandala of Kala Chakra is a phenomena, so mindfulness anyway. So maybe we could debate that. Actually, that's an interesting question, but in general, I guess you could think, you could say, well, mindfulness of karma, for example, is clearly taught in the Theravada. Mindfulness of your vows as a monk or a nun is clearly taught. So in that sense, you couldn't take that entirely literally unless you're meaning phenomena in that broad sense. I think then you could say that. So that's the point of, I guess you could debate it that way.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And then my other question is about just above the section, the text on 28, with where you just quoted Nagarjuna, just above that I'm having difficulty understanding the difference between 2 and 3. So what is that? The non-forgetfulness of the mind and non-distraction is it just temporal, the distinction between the two?
If you look at the second part, like the definition, or the elaboration by Yeshi Gelson, he says here, even though the mind might have previously familiarized with an object, if it does not presently dawn as an object of mind, mindfulness will not occur. Thus the subject. So I would say the second one means it must be currently present in your mind, right? So this familiar object has to be actually there. Whereas and then the third one is you're not allowing your mind to drift away. Like so the second one I would say is like that is actually present in your mind and appearing to your mind, that familiar object. But the third feature, the non-distraction, means that it's serving a function. It's like the actual, like if you think about it, the subjective aspect feature means it's actually appearing, right? Whereas the functional feature means it's serving a function in that moment of not letting your mind jump away, like of not allowing the mind to drift away or jump away or move away from the object. So they're simultaneous. They're both aspects of mindfulness, but you can sort of see how they're different aspects, right? One aspect is kind of it's there, because there are other times where you could have the second, something could appear to your mind, but there's not that. If you're not having that functional feature of non-distraction, your mind will jump away immediately. So it has both, is I think what's important if it's mindfulness.
Thank you.
And then Lynn.
This is really interesting, and
We can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah. This is really interesting because it sort of goes into what I understand about how memory works, which is if you're too anxious, that is, you're not mindful, you can't get the memory into your mind, your short-term memory. So you don't have it. So a lot of people that have diseases, like the early days of HIV, people were so agitated that it looked like memory loss, but it was really the anxiety that led to not being able to take in memory, short-term memory. So this is saying the same thing, almost like you have to have the short-term memory present before you can get to the concentration on it. I mean, it's sort of the same concept or paradigm.
Yeah, and you're right. And what you're getting at, I think, is also that I mean, one point, you're getting a number of things, but one of them is that extreme anxiety would be an obstacle to mindfulness, right? And to recollect, in the recollection sense, and in the sense of non-distraction, both. Because and you're right, like when we're anxious, our mind is extremely distracted to whatever we're anxious about, and therefore we can't do very well with mindfulness. And actually, I'll just share. Scientific research has shown mindfulness practice helps decrease anxiety because they're actually inhibitory, right? In other words, anxiety inhibits mindfulness, but mindfulness also can inhibit anxiety. So if people who are anxious practice mindfulness regularly every day, for example, then their anxiety tends to, scientifically has been shown to actually decrease significantly because you can see how each inhibits the other. Yeah.
It sort of mitigates the other.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, it mitigates it so it ceases to exist. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's exactly right.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I think so too, yeah. Yeah, it's very good to practice. Yeah, that's why for people who are going through it. And it's funny, I'll share one reflection personally, like I've noticed with people, is that when people are going through a lot of anxiety, I often say this, it's the time when they least want to practice mindfulness, because mindfulness feels unpleasant at first, because you're having to actually sit with the anxiety. But if you sit with the anxiety and practice mindfulness, your anxiety will tend to get better. But people don't want to do it. But if they do it, the anxiety tends to get better. But it's harder to want to do mindfulness practice because it's unpleasant at first, because you want to sort of not be aware, people want to not be aware of what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, but it actually helps. Yeah. And you're right. It also helps with mindfulness practice, also helps with recollection. Keep going here. So then now he's going to quote Shantideva's Engaging the Bodhisattva's Deed, or Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, different translations of that title. But he says, even though learned, faithful, and diligent in effort, many become tainted by downfalls due to committing the fault of lacking introspection. So I'll pause on this verse for a second. What he's saying here is couple things. One is introspection goes along with mindfulness is one point. Introspection in this context doesn't mean, sometimes in English we say, oh, you're introspective, like you think about things and so on. That's not what it means here. What it means, introspection in this context means that you're monitoring whether you're remaining mindful, right? So mindfulness is a non-distraction, staying with the familiar object. Introspection is the part of your mind when you're practicing meditation that says, how am I doing? Am I staying with the object, right? So now what Shantideva is saying is, if you don't practice introspection, which goes along with mindfulness, so if you don't practice mindfulness introspection, then even if you're learned, even if you have faith, even if you make effort, what is it? Many become tainted by downfalls, right? And what this means is, what he's getting at is that mindfulness is required for morality, right? For ethics. That if you don't stay aware of your ethical, what's the word? Values, your ethical commitments, and so on, and if you're not introspective in the sense of noticing, have I forgotten? Then even though you're learned and faithful and diligent, you can do bad things, right? And downfalls, you'll break your commitments to yourself or to your abbot or to your guru, or and so on. Then it says, although they have amassed merit, it is pilfered by the thief of non-introspection, who follows upon the degeneration of mindfulness. They proceed to a bad migration. So it's quite clear what he's saying, right? In other words, if your mindfulness degenerates and you're not introspective, noticing your mindfulness is degenerated, right? Then even if you've created good karma in the past, you'll now destroy it, right? By harming others and thereby harming yourself, right? And therefore you'll go to a bad rebirth, right? To your own karma. So what that's getting at is quite clear, isn't it? That you see the point here, mindfulness is not just in meditation. When you're sitting in meditation, it's saying, right? So an example would be like, so let's say I'm going to give a simple example of what Shantideva is getting at here, right? Let's say you've practiced Dharma a lot, right? You've done different retreats and studied and so on. And then, but you're not being mindful and introspective. And then somebody comes along and says something very unpleasant to you, right? And then you become enraged, right? And then you're not aware of your own, you're not being introspective, right? So you're not admitting to yourself, oh, I've just become enraged. And then you act out with hatred, right? That's an example here, right? Then Shantideva says, then your own rage destroys your previous, or makes ineffective your previous good karma. You create a lot of bad karma, and it leads you to a bad migration, right? That's what it's getting at. So, I mean, that's just one example. There are countless examples, right? Or you read stories, right, of spiritual teachers who do unethical things, right? And that's what Shantideva is saying, is that's failure of mindfulness and introspection, right? That we have to, and what he's getting at, actually, it's funny, is like, what he's getting at really is Shantideva saying, that's what we say, right? We always need to be mindful to some extent, right? I mean, of our ethics, of our commitments, of our values, of our, commitment of non-harm, and so on. And why? Now he's going to explain further. This band of thieves, the afflictions, looks for an opportunity. Upon finding an opportunity, it pilfers my virtue and even destroys a life of a good migration. Right? So why do we have to remain mindful? Is that we have a tendency to give rise to mental afflictions, right? And there are countless, we'll go through lists of them here in this text, but there are countless mental afflictions, and there are root ones and secondary ones, but there are very, many different mental afflictions. And if we're not practicing mindfulness, then we can we're taken over by mental affliction. And it's connected to what the Lojong teachings, right? It was the 8 verses of Lojong say, the moment a mental affliction arises, I will, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but essentially recognize it and then avert it, apply an antidote. So, and that's training in ethics, right? And so what this is saying is, since we still have, once you're an arhat, you don't have any mental afflictions, right? But we're not arhats yet. So we have mental afflictions, so we have to practice mindfulness and introspection, Shantideva is saying, all the time, right? So you see now how broad the application of mindfulness is. And again, it's easy to look at somebody else and say, oh, wow, this person's, fake. They say they're that, but now they did this. But what Shantideva is saying is we're all vulnerable to that if we don't practice mindfulness and introspection. Then he says, therefore, mindfulness should never be displaced from the door of the mind, right? So that's what I was saying. There's no break from this kind of mindfulness, for mindfulness, especially of our ethics. If it does go, recalling the anguish of bad migrations, place it back. So I want to point out something there too, right? Shantideva, interesting. Again, this is not like, I think, actually, yeah, it's funny. I don't think, anyway, I don't think usually modern, most, sort of modern American mindfulness teachers would say this, but Shantideva does, right? Is fear is good, or is that we should be afraid. Like often as we say, oh, don't be, like I've seen actually people like quotes from some Buddhist teachers say, oh, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. Actually, Shantideva says you should be afraid. You still have mental afflictions. And you should be afraid because you can hurt people, right? Including yourself, as long as you have mental afflictions. So he says, so never forget your mindfulness, right? And then I think this last verse is kind of interesting to think about. He says, due to association with spiritual teachers, the teachings of the abbot, and fear, fortunate ones who act respectfully easily generate mindfulness. So he's saying something. How do you become more mindful? Right? And he's saying, associate with spiritual teachers, with abbots, right? with fear. So he's actually encouraging. He's saying, and there's a famous quote from Milarepa where he says, Milarepa says, he had killed people, right? And then he says, I went to the mountains because I was afraid. And he stayed in the mountains. And he says, now I've achieved the fearless state, right? He stayed there. He was terrified of his own bad karma and his own anger, right? And so he went into retreat. And he says, I stayed in retreat. And he says, now I've achieved the fearless state, right? Meaning now he has no more mental afflictions. So then he's no problem. But, Shantideva and Milarepa were saying the same thing. Until you achieve that state, fear is a good thing of certain things, right? Not fear of, they're not saying be afraid of external things. They're saying they're saying have appropriate fear of your own capacity for harm, right? And therefore practice mindfulness. And also, like, actually, I'll just made, for some reason, where it says the teaching of the abbot, it just made me remember. I remember one time, many years ago, Kent Rinpoche, I invited him, and he came to like a meeting of therapists that I was part of, and he just he was just sitting there. We were having like a discussion, and he was going to give some input from a Buddhist perspective. He gave wonderful input eventually, but even at the beginning, he was just sitting there, and I was acting. This is like, oh gosh, a long time ago now, and I was just acting how I acted with that group of people. They were friends. Like, so I was like happy and excited. I was probably more excited. Actually, I probably wasn't quite acting normal because I was so excited to have Kent Rinpoche there. Oh, and Nawang Jordan Rinpoche was there too, actually, I think. So both of them were there. And I was quite excited. And then I started looking at them and realizing, like, I was like, oh, I'm being an idiot. I was like by looking at them, I suddenly realized I was like, in my excitement, I was kind of being like, what's the word, unmindful, and a little immature, and a little kind of over, what the word is, like, there was some feeling like, oh wow, this is so exciting, and look how cool it is, and maybe I'm kind of cool or something, I don't know, whatever, some feeling like that. And then I was like, I suddenly became quite embarrassed just in that moment. And I was like, and my point is, that's mindfulness, right? Through association with the abbot. Kensher means abbot. Just his presence helped my mindfulness, which I wouldn't have noticed if he hadn't been there. I just would have thought, oh, hang out with friends and we're doing something positive. We're talking about how to help people. But in that moment, I wasn't actually. I was focused on something, I wasn't being mindful. And so the point I'm making is just like associating with people who are mindful, right? Associating with, I remember I always laugh at this. There's a Buddhist prayer. I can't remember which prayer it is now. It says, it might be the Sutra of Golden Light or something. But anyway, it says, it's talking about like confession. It was confession verses, and it's like confessing to fault. And it says, because I was youthful, because I was desirous, because I hung out with non-Aryas, I did stupid things, And what it's saying is, Shantideva is saying, how do you become more mindful? Well, choose who you spend time with carefully, right? Like, is what it's saying, because we're influenceable, right? We're not beyond that, and so we should be careful in who we spend time with, because we should be, and it's interesting, right? What Shantideva is saying, because we should be afraid of our own mental afflictions, that we have bad tendencies, right? And that they can be nurtured quite easily. And so we should put ourselves in circumstances that don't nurture our bad tendencies, but encourage us to be mindful and introspective. So then he says, now switching back to Yeshe Gelson. Yeshe Gelson says, the increase of all the excellent qualities of the paths and grounds are contingent upon the two, mindfulness and introspection. And all the accomplishments of meditative concentration of sutra and tantra are necessarily achieved through this special mindfulness. Therefore, this very method of relying on mindfulness is of the utmost importance for those who in their heart wish to practice. Right, so he's saying now it's the foundation of actual practice, right? And I just reflect, I think it was Geshe Rabten made a point. He said, when you're learning, right, you have to recollect, and focus on and not be distracted from what you're learning, right? When you're contemplating, you have to focus on and not be distracted from what you're contemplating. When you meditate, right, you of course have to practice mindfulness. When you're trying to be ethical, you have to be mindful of your ethical training, right? When you're trying to be generous, you have to stay mindful of your intention to be generous. That every good thing requires, that's what he's saying, is if any virtuous activity requires mindfulness to do it effectively. And certainly if you wanted to develop wisdom, understanding, emptiness, you have to be mindful of, emptiness. And if you're practicing tantra, you have to be mindful of the deity or the mandala and so on, right? And all that. So, all the practices require mindfulness. And then to finish the section, then he again quotes Shantideva, Guides and Bodhisattva's way of life. He says, "Let my gain and honor, my body and livelihood vanish, but let even my other virtues degenerate, but may my mind never degenerate. I urge you, those who wish to guard their minds, guard your mindfulness and introspection, even at the cost of your lives." And do you see, you see what he's getting? It's pretty obvious what he's saying, right? Shantideva here, right? But think of the power of that person or of that mental state, right? What is he saying? Everybody can, my gain and honor, right? He's saying, I can lose all my wealth, but let me not lose my mindfulness, right? I can lose my reputation, but let me not lose my mindfulness. My status and honor, I can lose that, but let me not lose my mindfulness, introspection. And it's because Shantideva is saying he understands, right, as he put it here, those who wish to guard their minds. He understands that the mind is the source, right, of everything, of happiness and suffering. And my point, just what he's hinting at here, is that people like us don't see it that way usually, right? We see external things as more the source of our well-being, right? Not so much our mind. And so he's saying, if you have Dharma wisdom, you'll understand that those external things are not so important. What's important is the mind. So even if you lose everything else, don't lose your mindfulness and introspection. It's Shantideva's practice advice. And do you see also, just pointing out, right, that this is Yeshe Gelson. Yeshe Gelson puts a great emphasis here on practice, doesn't he? On really practicing in daily life and how these things apply to life as it's, to practicing in the context of real life. And that's what he's getting at here. Right? If you get it. So, and the last thing I'll say is, and you get the idea because we're about to transition into this, that on the one hand, mindfulness is important for ethics and being a good human being. And on the other hand, it's also very important for developing meditative concentration, which is the next of these 5 mental factors. So you see the connection there? So mindfulness acts as a basis for concentration. Does that make sense? We're about to get to concentration next. So mindfulness is the basis that gives rise to or improves our concentration. Any more questions about mindfulness before I go on to concentration? Sujata.
I was just so struck by this idea that mindfulness and anxiety can't co-occur. And I was thinking about, it sort of led me to thinking about how when you're doing so I was trained for some years in this, just observing the physical sensation of the breath as it comes and goes, and then moving into body scanning. And what I noticed during that practice is that when you look very carefully at like a sensation like pain, like let's say I'm going to focus on pain in my knee, that it is actually hard to, those are conglomerate things, like pain is actually like pulsing. And so then like the instruction at that time was always to go to the subtler or the smaller, the subtler or the smaller. And that is how you continue to refine the mind. The same with the breath, like it starts with like breathing, but then you get down to this like subtlest, most sensation of the breath as it comes and goes, right? And that the thing that I noticed was that when you disaggregate, the thing ultimately disappears, like the larger thing disappears, right? Like, so if there's pain in the knee, but then you disaggregate it into pressure and pulsing and this and that and the other, that there's no pain, there's just this conglomerate. You don't actually, I should speak for myself, there were times when I didn't even experience a thing that I had previously experienced as pain. It was just like totally manageable now. And so it was interesting. I was just, but I guess it led to some confusion in my mind. So first of all, that was just like a neat realization that maybe the same thing is happening with anxiety, like that it's actually always just like a conglomerate of stuff. That's like, if you break it down, the list of things you're anxious about, like any one of those things is manageable if you just take them in order or whatever. Usually, sometimes it's really bad stuff and it's hard, but I think that where I was confused about the size of the familiar object, basically, is my question. Like, is there any instruction on that? Like when we're thinking about being mindful of the familiar object, like when is the familiar object too broad or too big, or is there any specific instruction on that? Because it does seem like when the instruction is to continue to refine and narrow, it seems like you're changing the object of meditation, right? Like starting with pain, and then I ended up with pulsing, and then I ended up with like little like feeling like electrical currents in my knee, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And when I was thinking about the past teachings in this class about, this like time or whatever, you get down to like the people who got down to the 120th of a finger snap, like, are they changing the object of meditation along the way? So I think it's kind of like the size of the object or the diversity of things within a single object and the capacity that my mind bounces between them until I keep narrowing. And so then it feels like I'm not remaining mindful of a single object.
That's interesting. I guess I'll say a few thoughts, and that are kind of related to what you said, and then I hopefully get to the answer directly of what I think at least is the answer to what you asked. But I was going to say a couple points. One is just a general point, just kind of related to something you said at the beginning. Two general points. One is, I actually just recently read there have been a number of articles like this, but I read one not too long, quite recently, that was saying that they actually did a study that showed that regarding pain, people with chronic pain, that mindfulness practice is more effective than medication management in the long run for chronic pain. That was actual scientific research that was showing. There were a number of studies, but they were sort of and they were actually saying that in the long run, teaching people with chronic pain mindfulness practice and having them practice it, if they're willing to practice it regularly, is more effective than medication management of pain, is one point. There have been previous studies like that, but this was a recent one that kind of was reinforcing that. Another is just what you said about anxiety. I'll make a point. The same thing happens. There was actually anxiety, if you start to analyze it, it's actually physical, like what the person notices is they say, oh, I'm noticing anxiety. But then if they start to actually practice, it's like, oh, there's a sensation here in my stomach, there's a sensation in my chest, there's a thought, and then you start to realize that anxiety is not a singular phenomena, actually, right? It's a label on a number of physiological sensations, a number of kinds of thoughts, so it's not there is no singular thing that is anxiety. It's a conglomeration of physiological and mental phenomena that we label anxiety. So similar to what you're saying, similar to pain in that way. But then I guess, and then getting to your actual question, like I actually think what you were taught and when you were doing that is correct. That you asked the way size, and actually well, I'll just say it the way I was thinking of it. I remember Ken Strimshy talking about this, that when we don't have good concentration yet, or good concentration, I guess, that it's better to start with a larger object and a more vague object, And then as your concentration improves, because there's the clarity, you know, mindfulness is about stability. But what you're getting at, I think, is that to develop meditation, you want both stability and clarity. And so the idea is that it's easier to have stability when the object is big. If we're not good at mindfulness yet, and we're trying to create stability. And what Kinshirshi said is you need first stability, then clarity. So the idea is it's better if we're beginners sometimes to start with a more vague object or a bigger object, because we need to create stability first. And then once we have a certain degree of stability, you actually want to refine the object to make it more smaller and also more vivid and also more detailed or precise, you know, if it's a deity, for example, or Buddha or something. You know, he said that one, like if you're starting with a visualization, you may start with a kind of vague image of the Buddha and not too, you know, it could be life-size or something. But as your concentration improves, it's actually good if the object becomes smaller and more vivid, because what you're trying to do is develop increased clarity then without disturbing the stability factor. So mindfulness mainly helps stability again. That's, you know, because it's non-distraction. But then as you progress, you want to have the increased clarity without losing the stability. So that's where, going to your question, that's where you want the object to become, you could say sometimes it's literally smaller, like in some of the visualizations, but or more precise or more vivid or more detailed or something. And that's not, and what I think the way, my understanding at least, which was that it's not changing the object as much as making it more refined. You know, like that you're sort of, if you think of like a line, Kinshirshi once gave the example, he said it's like a line drawing of the Buddha. And then, you know, so eventually it's becoming like more and more vivid until you can actually like see the whites of the eyes and but it's not changing the object, it's just making it more from a line drawing to a beautiful painting to a living being, or, you know, but it's the precision of it. It's not, you're not changing to the Tara or to, you know, if it's the Shakyamuni Buddha, you're not switching to Chinrezig or to Maitreya or something. So you're keeping the same object, but you can like refine it in a way. And that
I
helps your
think that
clarity.
my problem, I think my problem is just literally that I have insufficient practice. Like when you're describing the increased the vividness and clarity, like and yeah, like shrinking the object down, and then now you're saying like, you know, whoever your meditational deity is or whatever is with all the details in it. My mind is still, I mean, I just think I need to practice more. My mind is still jumping around between like, now I'm seeing the eyes and now I'm seeing the implements that they're holding. And now I'm seeing that, right? Like I can't hold it as a unitary thing. Versus I know other practices that I've done in the past, you're looking at a stone and it's like a simple stone and you put it on the ground and you just focus on the stone. The stone is, you know, easier in that sense. But I think I was curious about this, this disaggregating. And it's interesting that you brought up the deities who have like so many things happening, and if you shrink them, there's still all the things happening. So I think it's just a matter of, I think I'm having trouble understanding, and this is often where my questions on this particular topic land, which is that just go practice is what I've been told before, right? But it's like, how do we hold our minds on a single thing that has a multiplicity of things within the single thing? That is the struggle for me.
And what they say actually is that at the beginning, you're supposed to do what you're describing. In other words, it's supposed to be like, you know, you can see if it's a deity, for example, you can see the eyes, but then you lose track of the hair knot, or, you know, the hair, and then you notice the hair, but you lose track of the hand implement, and that's normal. But what they say is actually, I mean, in terms of this idea of size, like what they say is eventually you can come to the point where it's all like, you know, like when you look at it's actually interesting, isn't it? Because like if you look at a very beautiful painting, you can see the whole painting at once. You know, like if a painting really strikes you. But anyway, and then yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Because like there are these, you know, this from deity yoga practices, there come points where like then after the person can visualize the entire deity, right, that's the gross generation stage, and the subtle generation stage, they visualize the whole thing in the size of a drop, right, tiny, which is getting at this issue of size, and like that there's something you know, but we can't, I mean, you can't do that until you have the growth, you know. So it's like it has to go from the parts, you know, to then eventually it all appears at once, more and more, you know, and then then you can make it smaller as an object, which just refines your mind more. I think is what happens. That's what. Yeah. But you're right. Yeah, those. I mean, we can understand it intellectually, but to do it as a practice, it takes a lot of practice. isn't it? Oh, Lynn.
I mean, at the end there, you said what I was thinking, and I don't know if this is
Oh,
right.
there it is. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I don't know if this is right. Uh, if you're mindful, focusing on something that you're familiar with, you sort of go from a gross consciousness to a more subtle consciousness. How do you want to say it? It seems like it's a different kind of focus. It's different in quality. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And I don't know, is that the difference between gross perception and subtle perception? Because it seems like it's a different kind of consciousness of the object.
I guess I'll say a couple things. I mean, I want to clarify, like we're not. I mean, it's not gross and subtle in the sense that, like, Tantra uses certain ideas of gross and subtle. This is not about that. That's a different thing. So they'll both will be gross in the tantric sense of gross and subtle consciousness. All these will be gross consciousnesses in general that we're talking about today. But I think actually what you're getting at connects us to the next point, which is concentration. There is that as you practice mindfulness, this is actually, I mean, it's a good question that transitions us to the next point, is what happens, I think, that you're getting at, which I like how you put it, it's a different, how do you say it, a different quality?
Yeah, right.
Because what happens is, as you practice mindfulness, you start to develop concentration or meditative concentration. And that, you're right, we'll see in the next section here, that changes something in the quality of your experience. So there is, as you practice mindfulness, you develop your concentration, and that concentration indeed does change the quality of your experience of an object. And you'll see, it'll say here, it increases your wisdom or your intelligence or your understanding of objects, and and that's not, I mean, I don't say it's not the tantric sense of gross and subtle, but it really is experientially something quite significant. Is as you practice mindfulness, you develop this concentration, and concentration really changes your ability to understand things in a kind of profound way. And I think that's what you're getting at. I think that's right.
Right.
Well, so maybe I'll start in on concentration then, because that gets at what you were saying. And I think it'll help elaborate on that. So let's do that. So here he says, actually, it's interesting. Like he said Teng is in, but actually there are many people, like it's only Dalai Lama's first name, Tenzin, right? And many Tibetans. You'll know if anybody's hung out with Tibetans much, you meet somebody named Tenzin, especially because His Holiness. If people get named by His Holiness, oftentimes their first name is Tenzin. So Tenzin is here is translated meditative concentration. Some people. Geshe Rabtin's book and also Art Engel's book just translate as concentration, which I think is actually I personally think that's a better translation, because it's a kind of concentration that can include normal concentration and also meditative concentration. So I think for our purposes today, probably better to call it concentration, because concentration can include meditative concentration, but it also includes concentration in daily life, which we develop. It's part of, it's not just, it doesn't only happen in kind of a meditative state. Another point is this word concentration, or tenzin in Tibetan, is samadhi in Sanskrit. So you've heard the term probably, actually samadhi cushions or whatever, you may have heard the term samadhi, but the Sanskrit term samadhi is it's concentration, right? And it can also be meditative concentrations. And then one other point is, just to clarify, because you may have come across these terms, calm abiding, right, which we talk about, which is shamatha or shine in Tibetan, right? Shamatha is a very special type of concentration. So in other words, it's a subset, right? Concentration is a broad term, and then calm abiding, shamatha is one particular kind of concentration, state of concentration. So that's just terms. I just want to introduce these terms. Actually, and I'm going to go just a very, very short tangent here. So sometimes it made me think of this. It always makes me laugh. Was this the arrogance of the reflection of arrogance. Or there's a famous story that William James, right, the early American psychologist, he writes about in this one of his books, where he was discussing concentration, and he sat down at his desk and he tried to focus on one thing, and his mind got distracted. And he wrote in the book, I tried it and it's impossible to develop, abiding concentration. And I mean, it's kind of humor. I just find that funny, right? It's like the arrogance of, like I couldn't do it after a few minutes of trying, so it must be impossible. It's kind of funny, isn't it? Anyway, but of course, the meditative concentration, my goodness, like, I mean, this is not unique to Buddhism, right? Buddhist and Hindu yogis in particular have amazing, descriptions of the states of concentration. And there are many, many different, there are like lists in some texts of like hundreds of different types of concentration states of meditative concentration that bodhisattvas and other meditators can develop. So there's limitless types of concentration according to Buddhism. But now we're getting at just what's in general concentration. So he said, the question, what is concentration or meditative concentration? And the response, it is a one-pointedness of mind with respect to an imputed thing. It has the function of acting as support for knowledge. So I think it's getting at what Lynn asked about, I think, to some extent, and I think it's an interesting description. And it's a one-pointedness of mind with respect to an imputed thing. It has the function of acting as a support for knowledge. Art translates the same passage as it is a one-pointedness of mind towards an object that is being closely examined. So instead of imputed thing, he says it's closely examined. But interestingly, like in terms of this idea of it has the function of acting as a support for knowledge. Geshe Rabten says on that topic, it acts as a basis for the increase of intelligence. And he gives an interesting analogy. He says it's like a camera. He gives the analogy he lived in Europe, so he gives the analogy of a camera. He says, if a camera is shaking, like if you're not holding it still, your picture is blurry. But if your camera is very still, like on a tripod, right, then your image can be extremely clear. And he says the mind is like, it's like that. He's giving an analogy here, that through concentration, you can develop a very clear understanding or intelligence about a particular thing. So here I'll read some of this quote now Geshe Gelsen. Just as has been said above, it is a one-pointedness of mind that, within observing an imputed thing, is continuously set upon it. The objective feature of meditative concentration is specified to be an imputed thing, because when cultivating meditative concentration, one holds the mind to an object of observation that is imputed by the mind. So what's he saying here? He's saying that that it's a mental object, that for, I guess I want to say, like some of the commentaries make a point. We can develop a certain degree of concentration regarding objects of the physical senses, of course, right? But what he's getting at here is this type of concentration, real meditative concentration, eventually one focuses on a mental object. That's what he's saying, actually. That's the definition. One point I want to make, just as my own reflection now. One is, I guess, first I won't give my own reflection. This point about it must be an object of mind, meaning an imputed thing, it means an object of mind, is the commentaries clarify, both Asanga and Vasubandhu say it must be an object, a mental object, not a sensory object. Another point I want to make, this is just my own reflection now, is also because remember in the definitions that we've covered previously in classes, because right, it's a single one-pointedness of mind on, so it's a stable, right, a stable one-pointed mind focusing on a thing. I want to point something out, which is that let's see this right way. Physical objects, right, like sensory objects, are impermanent. They change moment to moment, right? So you can't, what this is getting, there's an implication here, which is you can't hold the mind single-pointedly and unwaveringly on something that doesn't abide in the next moment, right? If you actually get into the moment-to-moment awareness, you can't develop single-pointed, stable, right? It says here, one-pointedness of mind over time, right, is what this is. This is my own reflection now, but I'm just sharing it, is that you can't do that if the thing doesn't abide for a second instant, right? But remember in the definitions, mental objects are not changing instant by instant, right? Remember in the definitions of these things, right? We call them a generic image or mental image or whatever, these different terms we had. We call them permanent, not in the sense of eternal, but not changing instant to instant, right? So you can develop a single pointed concentration on a mental object because it's not changing instant by instant. The mind changes instant by instant because it's a functional impermanent phenomena. But mental objects are not that type of thing, right? They're not. And so the point here is that Asanga and Vasubandhu say when developing meditative concentration, you must choose a mental object to develop this particular kind of concentration. That's one point. Anyway, and so that's interesting, isn't it? Like, so, and if you look in, anyway, so yeah, if you, so when choosing an object for cultivating your own meditative concentration, right, this is implying, if you're trying to develop single pointedness of mind, it's best that it be a mental object, not a sensory object. So something that appears to the mind, not to the senses, right? So, for example, if you were staring at a flame, right, in a candle, that would not be a suitable object for developing this type of concentration, right? It should be a mental object. Then he said, and he says here, well, then he says, furthermore, although there appear to be many enumerations of the object of observation for meditative concentration, when it's condensed, it's taught that there are 4 categories. I'll get to that in a second. I want to go back and just cover a little more here. There. I was going to say, you know, our text here says it functions as support for knowledge. Geshe Rabten says it acts as a basis for increasing of intelligence. And Art uses this phrase, it's a one-pointedness of mind towards an object that is being closely examined. And I want to just elaborate there. Our translation of Vasubandhu's text says, it must have a specific object which is being closely examined. And then it says, complete and true knowledge of a topic requires concentration on that topic or object. You can concentrate on the unique and general characteristics of the object. So what this is getting at, in a way, is that it's interesting, isn't it? Is that when you develop concentration, you know, first you're mindful of an object, right? And you don't allow for distraction. And then there comes a one-pointedness of mind that can hold the object. And what this is getting at is that kind of one-pointedness of mind, that kind of concentration, allows for you to examine and understand the object in new ways. And I think this is connected to what you were saying, Lynn, is that through this process of concentration, you can develop a kind of intelligence or understanding or examination of phenomena that allows for a kind of unique understanding or unique intelligence that isn't possible without concentration. So mindfulness leads to concentration, which leads to this kind of capacity for understanding, for examination, for seeing or understanding both the general and specific characteristics of a thing. That's a kind of intelligence or, yeah, understanding. We'll say more about that, but I want to pause because John had a question and then Wilhelmina. John, I guess you had your hand up first.
Yeah, I'm getting maybe caught up, but maybe I'm just confused. What I thought I heard you say was it has to be a mental object, not a sensory object. Now, before we had talked about the fact that it has to be something you're familiar with. So if it's a sensory object that you have a mental image of, I mean, is that correct? Or is that, I mean, it's got to be something that's not sensory at all?
No, you're right. It could be either.
How can, if it's not sensory, how can you truly be familiar with it?
Well, say, I think you're onto something that's useful, I think, and helpful, which is it can be, so in terms of concentration, the object of concentration can be, like if in this definition, right, it's a something imputed, something mental. So a mental object can be, on the one hand, there are various kinds of mental objects, right? One is a mental image of something you experienced previously in a sensory way, right? That's what you're getting at, John, I think, is like one possibility is, let's say using, I think it was an example Sujata gave earlier, if somebody looked at a certain stone and then they close their eyes and they hold a mental image of that stone, they can concentrate on that. That's one type. And that would be an example where it was previously, you had a sensory experience previously of an object. Now you have a mental image of the object and then you concentrate on that. Another example
that would count. So that would actually count then.
Yeah, that would count because it's mental now. Or same
Even
thing.
though it was a sensory object, you no longer have the sensory object in front of you. So it's a mental object of a sensory experience.
Exactly. Yep. So that would count. And then there are other objects though that were never sensory, and an example of that would be, let's say, emptiness, right? Like somebody could develop through reasoning, could develop a mental image of emptiness. Like, so that somebody contemplates the words that their teacher taught, that, let's say you listen to teachings by His Holiness the Dalai Lama or something, and you contemplate them and you develop some level of understanding of emptiness, right?
Mhm.
And then you develop concentration on that understanding. That was never a sensory experience in the sense that, your a non-affirming negation wasn't something you saw or heard with, you heard words that helped you think about it, but the actual non-affirming negation of emptiness was not something you touched or tasted, but that would be a mental object that you could then concentrate on. So it could be, so there are different types. There are mental objects that that are derivative of a previous sensory experience, and there are some that are not directly derivative of a previous sensory experience. The emptiness is my example. So both are, but either one could be the object here.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And then Wilhelmina? Oh, Wilhelmina, you have to unmute.
Unmute.
Oh, there you are. Good.
Unmute. Okay.
Yep, you're good.
You answered the question because I was thinking about a mental object, but then it disappears, and what do you do then? Or do I have the wrong object or whatever? But you explained that, so I'm happy to hear that, because then you concentrate on an emptiness. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. And then Damchu has her hand up.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can ask this in an intelligent way, but basically, let's say on emptiness, you first have a mental image, but you're proceeding towards a direct realization. So what is that when that mental image fades? Because it's not sensory. So, and it's not changing, correct? It's permanent, but you're perceiving it. So how are we looking at the perception of it? Is it, it's not conceptual, so there's no mental, I just don't get what you're actually seeing, I guess. I mean, when the image fades, because I understand the direct experience of sensory things.
Right.
And then I also get the difference between when you have a mental image of them. And sometimes it happens very fast. But I guess because I'm so far off from direct realization, I have no clue what I'm talking about here. But basically, what's happening? Because it's not sensory, it's not a mental image. Is it just mental consciousness?
So your mind at that point is right. It's actually actually, if you go back, like there are various kinds of mental direct perceptions, right? Like, yeah. So, one example of a mental direct perception is when you see, like if somebody's clairvoyant, they can see somebody else's thought.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and that's a direct mental, like, so in other words, if a person were clairvoyant and then they're directly perceiving somebody else's thought, that's a mental direct perception. They're not seeing it with their eyes or ears or nose, they're seeing it with their mind. And it's an object of the mind. But it's seen directly. It's not a concept about their thought. It's an actual direct seeing of it. So I think it would be comparable to that, wouldn't it? It would be like something. So yeah. It's an existent phenomena that's seen directly by the mind.
Okay.
and emptiness exists, so it can be seen, by the mind, and it can't be seen any other way. And emptiness can only be an object of mind, can it? It's not something you can see with your ears or your nose or your tongue. So it'd be an existent phenomena that's seen directly by the mind. But yeah, I think that's a good analogy, isn't it? Like a clairvoyant person can see.
Yeah.
And actually, another example would be subtle impermanence, right? Like in other words, there comes a point where a person has a mental image of subtle impermanence, and then one mentally directly sees subtle impermanence. So there are these there are various examples of sort of mental direct perception. That's what it would be.
And for us, that mental direct perception is usually happening so fast we can't even perceive it. But at some point, because your concentration is so good, you can hold it and hold it and hold it. Okay, got it. Yeah, got it. I mean, I get it. Obviously, not to my experience.
Me too.
Thank you.
And then, Lynn has her hand up.
I thought the photograph was fascinating because I often take photographs of someplace I've been, and then I look at the photograph and it's very different than what I remember. It has more brilliant colors. It's just very different. So it's interesting that you're drawing the distinction between a photograph captures something at one particular moment, and that is different than the mental image you have of the experience. So that's just very concrete.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what Geshe Radton was getting at there is in part was that, he was using the analogy of a blurry picture versus a clear one to make this point of that as you develop concentration, there's a stability and a clarity that allows you to kind of see something in a certain way, that's different than if you're distracted or not concentrated. Another analogy they sometimes give for that point in some Buddhist texts is they'll give this example because they're very Tibetan, I think. If you go in if you go in a temple and the lighting is dim and you're holding a butter lamp, is the analogy. That's the Tibetan, right? The Tibetans use butter lamps a lot. What they'll say is if you're trying to look at the tankas, if it's very windy in the if the door is open and the wind is blowing, you won't get a very clear image of the tankas. Areas even if you're holding a butter lamp there, or if there are a few butter lamps lit, whereas if you close all the windows and doors and the lamp is very still or very unwavering, then you can get a clear vision of the tanka. And the analogy they're giving is that that without concentration we can't really see objects very clearly. That they're kind of, because our mind isn't able to hold them. Whereas when you can concentrate on an object of mind, you can, just a metaphor for getting at that then there comes an ability to have an understanding or an examination or an intelligence about that object that's deeper and more unique, because you can examine the object with a kind of depth of concentration that isn't possible without that. So that's I think what they're trying to get at in that, those analogies.
Well, and it doesn't change. A mental image doesn't change, whereas what we see in the world changes.
Yeah.
A photograph doesn't change. It's a moment in time. So it's sort of the same thing. It's like a fixed image, like what we should be concentrating on, our mental image.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, whereas when you're at the place, it was an impermanent everything. There were and also and it wasn't just visual, right? There were sounds and smells and tastes and other sensory touch, all kinds of experiences that were, and they were impermanent. Yeah, whereas
it sort of colors your memory of what you saw because it was impermanent. We don't realize it usually. We think, okay, this is a moment in time, but it's not. And the camera captures the moment in time, and your mind does not necessarily.
Yeah. Interesting point. Wow. We'll go a little further. So that next he said, so I'd gotten up to this point and I stopped, but he says, so when condensed, so he says here, furthermore, there may appear to be there appear to be many enumerations of the objects of observation for meditative concentration. When condensed, it is taught that there are 4. So the point here is that there are many different things as I said earlier, there are many different things you can concentrate on. But here, this is a traditional list of 4. So we can go over them. The first is objects of observation for purifying behavior. And the traditional examples of those, which you'll see in Buddhist texts, this list is from Buddhist texts, right? So the objects of observation for purifying behavior, they give examples. And again, you'll be familiar with these if you've read various texts. But one list of those is meditating on ugliness as an antidote to attachment, meditating on love as an antidote to anger, meditating on dependent arising as an antidote to ignorance, meditating on the differentiation of the constituents, so the varieties of phenomena as an antidote to pride, thinking you know something. It says you meditate on how much there is to know, then you realize there's so much you don't know. So that's an antidote to pride. And then meditating on the inhalation and exhalation of the breath as an antidote to excessive discursive thinking. So that's one list. But so in general, these objects of observation for purifying behavior are that, and this is taught in the Lamrim, if you've read in the Lamrim, is that for some, if we have a particular proclivity towards one kind of mental affliction or mental problem, then we can choose as our object the antidote to that, right? And focus on that object, and that'll help us. So if we're too, if we're very angry, then it's great to meditate on love quite a lot, and there are many yogis, right? Like there are a number of great yogis who that was their practice, was meditation on love, and they became one of Atisha's teachers, I think it was Dharma Rakshita, was like that, where his main practice was love, but anyway, so you can pick any one of these. And I sometimes think, actually, many Buddhist teachers when they came to this country taught inhalation and exhalation meditation. I think that partly that may be because there was a recognition of excessive discursive thinking, so need to calm that down. Oh, Anna, you have your hand up. You can go ahead. Oh, you're muted though.
Yeah, I have a short question about the meditative concentration.
Sure.
So is this overlap with karma binding? When you get into karma binding, are you still in the meditative concentration status?
Yeah. So karma binding is a very so in other words, karma binding is one type of meditative concentration. So in other words, so that would be a very and I we as ordinary people can start with a certain level of meditative concentration, and eventually you can. Karma binding is one of many types of meditative concentration, and it's quite a good, it's type that we want to aim for as practitioners. But then even after karma binding, then one can achieve, the form realm concentrations and the formless realm concentrations. So there are many different concentrations, but yes, to answer your question, karma binding is one type of meditative concentration.
Okay. Yeah, I have another short question about the. So how do we use the meditative concentration to increase our wisdom? Like you mentioned, we contemplate on the emptiness. So for a while, we may increase our understanding of the emptiness. Is that always happen?
So so the idea is that great question, first of all, and so the idea is that if we first we have to we can think about emptiness, and that's quite good. But what they say actually is that we have so if it's a one-pointedness of mind, right? Meditative concentration is a one-pointedness of mind. So usually when they teach how to meditate on emptiness, right, they'll say first apply the reasoning. There are different reasonings to prove emptiness, right? Like dependent origination, or not one and not many, or many. There are different ones, right? Unarisen. There are different types of reasonings. But once you apply the reasoning, what you're supposed to do then is you come to an understanding of emptiness, and then you absorb your mind in that. And what they say is that it should be at that time, you don't allow for distraction, right? You just stay in this state that's like a space-like equipoise, a space-like emptiness after reasoning, right? Mm-hmm. And you stay in that state as long as you can. And that is increasing your wisdom. So when you stay in that state, it's not enough just to think about first we have to reason and contemplate and think about emptiness. But actually, it's really interesting. They say that's not enough, right? If you only just intellectually think about it, that won't be very effective by itself in increasing your wisdom. You have to then, when you come to a conclusion, whatever level of conclusion we come to, it changes over time as we get better at it, understanding emptiness. But what they say is whatever level of understanding you have, then you concentrate on that. And by letting your mind deeply concentrate within that state, it increases your wisdom, understanding emptiness. And like Kensler Rinpoche said, if you do that, I was just editing some materials on this, where he was saying this. He said, every time when you meditate on emptiness like this, you then at the end, you spend some time really absorbing your mind or concentrating your mind within that understanding of emptiness. And he said, if you do that over and over, then over years, then your meditation on emptiness will become, your wisdom understanding emptiness will improve, and that's how it will get better. So he says like that is very important to increase your wisdom understanding emptiness, and eventually that will help you realize emptiness. So he was saying that you have to like really concentrate within that awareness. So first you contemplate and think, but then you concentrate and you keep your mind one-pointedly on your understanding. And even if our understanding isn't perfect, that's okay. We stay within that best understanding we can. And what Kensler Rinpoche was saying is by doing that, then your understanding improves over time, because of what this text is saying, which is, because it's like it acts as support for knowledge, that your knowledge actually will improve partly through this absorption or this concentration.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Yeah. Okay, so I will continue on this 4. So the first one was I give the examples. So there are all different kinds of objects for purifying behavior. That was a list of certain ones, but there are other antidotes also, right? Like, so you can, that one is like examples where you meditate on an antidote to a particular mental affliction. Then objects of observation for purifying afflictions, that mainly applies to special insight. So the main objects there would be either emptiness. The main one, actually, Anna just asked about it. So the main one for number 2 here, objects of observation for purifying the afflictions, would be emptiness. But it could also be a special insight, we talked about this before, into understanding the faults of, like for example, if you're going through the different realms of the form and formless realms, another kind of special insight you can cultivate that would be for purifying the afflictions would be seeing the faults of the Zaya realm, for example, and the advantages of the form realm, or seeing the faults of the first level of the form realm, the advantages of the second, and then that's how you achieve those other levels of the form realm or formless realm, and so on. So those would be examples of the second objects of observation for purifying the afflictions. And the supreme one of those would be meditation on emptiness. Then pervasive objects of observation would be there are discursive images and non-discursive images. So those would be like mental images, basically, in brief, different kinds of mental images. And then the last is objects of observation for developing skill. And below, Yeshe Gelsen says, although objects of observation for developing skill are taught to be of infinite types, some objects of observation of the 5 aggregates, the 18 constituents, the 12 sources, observation of the 12 links of dependent origination, and so forth. And so this could be like, keeping your mind on the awareness of those objects, right? The 12 sources or the 5 aggregates. And there's another category in that one, which is what's possible and what's not possible. That's understanding karma. So there are these different topics where you concentrate single-pointedly on them. And you can understand then, like they say, for example, the 5 aggregates can include all impermanent phenomena. So you would understand how that's a person, how they're the 5 aggregates are. You would have some understanding of how the 5 aggregates are what constitute the basis of designation for a person, and how they include the all impermanent phenomena could be included in the 5 aggregates. There are different ways of analyzing them, but the point is these are for increasing your wisdom, right? That you would concentrate on. You can concentrate on a certain object for developing skill, where you're concentrating on these topics in order to develop a skill understanding them. Is the point here. So you would concentrate them to increase your. This is getting at the increasing intelligence part. That you would concentrate on these topics in order to develop an increased skill in understanding these points of the Dharma. I guess one way of putting that. But Sujata has her hand up.
Yeah, so I am confused about how you can focus single pointedly on things in this category. It feels, and again, this just might be my complete lack of, you know, development along the path, but to me, it just automatically feels discursive. But even when I'm, making efforts at these things, I feel like my mind is thinking instead of focusing. And so if you could explain a little bit more about that, that would be really helpful. Thanks, Lauren.
I go back to Art's, I'm actually put it up right here. Art Engel's, I'm quoting from The Inner Science of Buddhist Practice, which is a translation actually by Art Engel of Vasubandhu's summary of the 5 heaps, the 5 aggregates, with a commentary by Srimati. He gets to this in an interesting way in his translation, so I'll read what he says about it because I think it clarifies what you're asking. He says, in response to the question, what is concentration? The root text by Vasubandhu declares a one-pointedness of mind towards an object that is being closely examined. The description of the object as one that is being closely examined indicates that concentration will not be achieved otherwise. Thus, concentration is also being presented as a mental factor that has a specific object. The phrase, an object that is being closely examined, refers to those objects that are closely examined with regards to having good qualities and bad qualities. A one-pointedness of mind means that it's a state of holding that object in mind, and that object is referred to as what is referred to as the one-pointedness. Go back here. And then it says here, the action of concentration is to provide a support for knowledge, because the scripture, as the scriptures say, because a complete and true knowledge occurs when the mind is well composed, meaning concentrated. The objects that receive close examination are the Four Noble Truths. The truth of cessation is examined with respect to its being in a state of peace and the rest. The object of the path, the truth of the path is examined, and so on. He goes on to elaborate. So what he's saying here is, when he talks about, he uses this phrase, closely examined. What he's getting at is, it can be, and on the one hand, it can be a single object, like let's say a mental image of a syllable, right? But it can also be, the object can be the Four Noble Truths. In other words, what he's getting at, right? He says it very clearly there. So in this sense, one can focus, say, okay, my object of concentration is the Four Noble Truths. I'm going to single-pointedly focus on the Four Noble Truths, meaning anything other than the Four Noble Truths will not arise from my mind. But within that, one can then examine the 16 aspects. He's giving examples here of the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. So in that sense, the one object is the Four Noble Truths, but you can then examine, according to what he's saying, the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. And you're still on that one object, which is the Four Noble Truths. So according to Vasubandhu, the object upon which you're single-pointedly concentrating can be something that's in relation to which you're having discursive thinking, right? Because that's clear, right? If you think about the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, that's discursive. So it is possible. So it can be non-discursive concentration, or there's discursive concentration, obviously, according to Vasubandhu's definition, right? Because he's saying here, close examination, he gives the example, objects that can receive such close examination are the Four Noble Truths. And then he lists some of the 16 aspects. So that fits with what we were just saying here, where it was, so if you were meditating on, say, dependent origination as your single object, right? There are 12 links of dependent origination. So any of those, if you were going through the forward order and the reverse order of the 12 links of dependent origination and understanding how they relate to each other, that would still be categorized as meditative concentration, because you're staying on that object, which is 12 links of dependent origination. Or it would be in Art's example here, or in Vasubandhu's rather, the Four Noble Truths. And he gives other examples, which are, he gives another example. The 9 levels. So another one would be, he gives the example that I just gave, which is, so if you're looking at the faults of the desire realm and the advantages of the form realm, right? There's still some discursive thinking going on, right? Because you're thinking, this has this fault and this suffering, and that is more blissful. but it's within, you're just focusing on the faults of the one and the advantages of the other in order to develop special insight about that. So that would still be considered meditative concentration, according to the definition.
I think I think that maybe I'm having a difficulty between, or there's this sense that you said earlier about concentration, like regular concentration. So let's say you're focusing on the Four Noble Truths, and you think, you are concentrating on them for 20 minutes without interruption, right? Your mind hasn't wandered to, oh, let me pick up my cup of tea, or let me, like, you just with those Four Noble Truths for 20 minutes. And I see that as like conventional concentration, but the word meditative, I think, is where I get tripped up. Because when I think about meditative concentration, I think of like fixing the mind on a single object without it wavering. And to my mind, thinking about Four Noble Truths, you're going to waver. There's wavering in that, right? Like you waver between truth one and truth two. It's wavering is maybe the wrong word, or just that there is movement instead of a singularity of focus. And that, I think, I'm trying to understand. Maybe this is why in the beginning, just the word concentration instead of meditative concentration, that was what you were getting at by saying that might be a better description. Is that correct?
Yeah, I totally prefer concentration as the translation here. And that's why I like that both Geshe Rabton and Art translate this as concentration, not as meditative concentration, which I think fits better for me with this description, right? The definition and the way it's being described. So for me, that's a better, I don't know, I mean, because meditative concentration would be one type of concentration then. And again, because actually, I just want to go back, like according to this, I mean, these are examples of Buddhist, right? All these topics, which make sense, right? It's Buddhist text, so they're giving examples of Buddhist objects of concentration. But like, if like concentration would include, like, I mean, if you think of a mundane example, right? When Einstein was sitting contemplating, when he was going over and over, what's the word, like relativity, right? Like that's not something, it's not a Buddhist insight, I mean, it was an insight of physics. But this definition would say he was practicing concentration, not meditative concentration, but he was concentrating on a particular topic. And for him, that was one topic, and he was looking at it from, I'm sure, different angles or something, and then had an insight about it. That would be an example of concentration, or even like if somebody's, like when you're a child and you're learning something new, and then you're staying on that topic, like you learn something in class and you have homework, and you're sitting there and you're really thinking about some topic, that would be concentration, even though you're looking at it from different angles, for example, like, yeah, so that would still be concentration in a sense, but that's not a meditative concentration. So I personally prefer, that's for all those reasons. I prefer, given the definition, for me personally, concentration works better. So I agree with Art and Geshe Rabton's translator. And I think better to think of meditative concentration as one type of concentration, because yeah, if you look at these examples, again, if you apply it to the mundane, that's why, right? Like if you think of somebody who's contemplating a particular mathematical concept, for example, they're concentrating on it in order to develop intelligence about it. And they could really be very focused on it with single-pointedly, no other thoughts arising about other topics, because they're really focused. But that's not technically meditative concentration, I wouldn't say. So I think it's a better translation personally.
Just one small follow-up on that. So then when I think about samadhi, you couldn't develop samadhi on something in which the mind was going to move, right? So like you don't develop samadhi on the Four Noble Truths, for example. It would need to be something more singular than that.
Actually, it's interesting though, according to this text, right, they're saying it is possible, right? Because I mean, Tenzin is samadhi. Tenzin is the Tibetan word for samadhi. And actually, so I mean, according to Vas, I mean, actually, I'll just say,
I'm so sorry. I meant shamatha, not
shamatha.
samadhi.
You can't. No, yeah, that's right. Shamatha, you can't. Yeah, that's the difference. So you can develop. That's an important distinction. You can develop samadhi, right? Because that's what in Vasubandhu's text he's talking about. He's using the word samadhi actually, right? Which are translated as concentration. So yeah, that's an important distinction. For samadhi, it can be something like the Four Noble Truths. But for shamatha, yeah, it would have to be a singular. Or more, what's the word? Unmoving also, yeah. At least at first, right? Then eventually when you have the union of combining special insight, then it's again, you can have, there comes a point where movement of the mind and that the movement of the mind actually enhances your concentration at a certain point, but that's after you've developed shamatha. So that's, you can't do that until after, you can do it again after shamatha when you're trying to cultivate the union of shamatha and vipassana, but you can't do it as a way of developing shamatha. So yeah, that's right. Is that? And that's the difference between samadhi and
Thanks, so helpful.
shamatha. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure. Well, and maybe I'll just call, yeah, we're almost out of time, but I'll just say, I'll cover this one more paragraph and then we'll stop there, just because I think it's a better stopping place. So it says here, I'll just leave the last part. It says here, nowadays, there are some instructions at odds with the wording of the Conqueror's scriptures that clearly teach that the method of performing staring meditation within observation of a form appearing to eye consciousness. However, Arya Sangha clearly stated that meditative concentration is not produced in sense consciousnesses. Rather, it is only produced in a mental consciousness. Moreover, it is an object of observation. Moreover, its object of observation is not form appearing to a sense consciousness. Rather, it is only a mental object imputed by the mind. So we already covered that. So that's what I just wanted to say. So here he's just saying, this is clearly the position of a Sangha and also Vasubandhu, is that it must be a mental object. And he's saying, and he's giving, I already said that, right? Staring at a candle, or the candle can't be the object of samadhi. There's a sensory object like a candle, or even clouds in the sky or something. I mean, you can do those things, but you can't do the for shamatha, right? Shamatha has to be a mental object, he's saying, and he's saying that very clearly. John. Yep.
Sorry, it took me a while to get the mute off. Ian, I keep getting confused between maybe different parts. Can you have a mental image of the clouds?
Yep.
As the object?
Yes, that can be the object.
So that can be the focus. You can't have physical clouds to focus at, but if you're concentrating and can concentrate on an image of clouds, then it does work.
Yep. Yeah, all he's saying is it can't be, that your object can't be something appearing in that moment as a sensory phenomenon. It has to be an object of mental consciousness, right? It says here, it is only produced in the mental consciousness. So if you were to have a mental image of a flame, actually that is, actually that's a great example. Like there are Buddhist practices where the mental image of a flame is the object of concentration, but it's not looking at a flame, it's a mental image of a flame. It's a mental, it's appearing to the mind, not to the eyes, for example.
Well, I think you've done it a lot of times. A teacher will ask the students to create a mental image, possibly of a crown or of one of the deities. Yeah. And you're creating a mental image. There actually may not be a picture of green Tara at that moment.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a suitable object of samadhi then. Yep. Oh, well, we're at 12:30, so we'll do our dedication, and it's up on the website, the dates for September and October, so good for a while. We can do our dedication now. So, the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it rise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara's end. And dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so that the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And thanks, everybody. Good to see you. See you all. See you soon.